Hello, everyone. As you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from, what brought you here today. Love to hear from you. It's like we're about a third of the way there in terms of numbers. If you just want to tell us where you're tuning in from, what brought you to this particular program. I have a virtual background behind me, but it is the Mark Twain House. You see the conservatory this way. And this is the library behind me. It's like we have someone from the Toronto area, a couple of people from Connecticut, different parts of the small state. Dublin, but Dublin in Ohio rather than Ireland, and the Bronx. Soda as well. Coventry, both in Ohio, Indiana, and, from our friends at the Windsor Historical Society. Welcome, Cromwell. So I'll just go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to host today's program, Women of the American West. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We're also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and our other virtual programs. We would also like to thank the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. Founded in 1955, the museum, located in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, collects, preserves, and exhibits an internationally renowned collection of Western art and artifacts while sponsoring dynamic educational programs to stimulate interest in the enduring legacy of the American West for its diverse audiences. Now let me introduce our guests. We are welcoming Katie Hickman and April White for a discussion with Michael Grauer about the pioneering, adventurous, and oft-neglected women as chronicled in Katie's book, Bravehearted, The Women of the American West, and April's book, The Divorce Colony. Our first author is Katie Hickman. She is the best-selling author of 10 books. Her first novel, The Quetzal Summer, was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Young British Writer of the Year Award. Her books have been translated into over 20 languages. Our second author is April White. She's a senior writer and editor at Atlas Obscura. She previously worked as an editor at Smithsonian Magazine. She holds a master's degree in history, and her work has appeared in numerous publications, including JSTOR Daily, where she wrote a regular column on the history of food. And our moderator is Michael Grauer. He's the McCasland Chair of Cowboy Culture, Curator of Cowboy Collections and Western Art at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. He worked at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Panhandle Plains Historical Museum before joining the National Cowboy Museum in 2018. Now we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section at the bottom center of the screen. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. So that's it from me. Please sit back and enjoy. Over to you, Katie, April, and Michael.
Hello. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we're just waiting for Michael to come. There's Michael. Ah, he's got his hat on. That's good. He didn't have his hat on before. I wondered why you had to disappear, Michael.
Wardrobe change.
Yeah. You look the part now. It's good.
Well, as moderator, obviously the most obvious question for both you writers and scholars is why you chose your topics and why specifically within your volumes did you focus on those particular stories. Let's start with April.
Sure. So I chose my topic basically when I saw the words "the divorce colony," which of course is the title of the book. It was such a fascinating phrase for me, and I needed to figure out what it was. I'd been researching something else actually, and it immediately took me to Sioux Falls, where this divorce colony was based, and into this story that was, at first glance, scandalous and salacious. And then as I dug further into it, a really fascinating tipping point in our understanding of divorce in the United States. So for me, having sort of all those levels to this story is what really drew me to this particular topic.
Great. Okay. Well, I loved your book, April. It's absolutely great book. I wrote Bravehearted. I have a sort of lifelong writerly interest in women's histories, and specifically in bringing out the stories, women's stories that have been neglected or brushed under the carpet because they were too scandalous to be told, or just, generally speaking, because in the past, women's voices have had a tendency to be really drowned out by men's voices. And so now it's time to, let them have their share of the world stage, so to speak. So I've done a number of books. This is my fourth book on women's histories, and I always wanted to find a subject that would allow me to write about the United States, because I always was really interested in United States history. And the specific idea for this, it's a book about the westward migrations in the mid-19th century, was I found a book of photographs in a very famous Parisian bookshop called Shakespeare & Co. Some of you, I'm sure, have been there. It's the English-speaking, English language books. And they were the most beautiful photographs, black and white, silver gelatin print photographs of all kinds of different women on the westward journey. So they weren't just, white women in sunbonnets. They weren't they weren't only the very conventional, almost cliched, view that we're all familiar with, but they showed African-American women, Chinese women, Mexican women, and most importantly of all, very unusually, they also showed a number of Native American women, and their stories are very often neglected. So that was my, that was the beginning of my journey, and the result a long time later, about 10, I've had that book for about 10 years on my shelves, and it finally came out just recently.
Let's pick up on that, the reference you made to the cliches about women in the American West being limited, and let's think about it in terms of the cliches, but also in the fact that in both your books it's about transhumans, people moving back and forth into the West and out of the West sometimes, and then back to the West, etc. So April, could you speak a little bit about the cliches that you ran into in your research and in your writing of your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, I write about the women who go from the East mainly to Sioux Falls, South Dakota in search of a divorce. Now, I am writing primarily and almost exclusively about wealthy white women, and there's really clear reasons for that, which is this was an expensive endeavor that required a lot of time and money. It was also one that required knowledge. And so if you had not had someone from your social circle go out to Sioux Falls to make this sort of unusual journey for a divorce, you may not have understood how to do this and what it would take. So you do see a kind of affinity groups going out there. But, what the city expected of these women was just this idea of a fallen woman who is scandalous and extravagant and really different from the type of person who would travel out to Sioux Falls to establish their life there. And that stereotype was, you know, very easily blown up if you spent any time talking to these women, learning about their lives, learning about their interests. And so it was pretty fascinating to me to be able to tell in my book 4 different women's stories, the reasons they marry, the reasons they divorce, how they get to Sioux Falls, what they choose to do after, and get as up close and personal to those stories as I could, to show that these were not a monolith, to show that these were very individual people doing individual things, and blowing up some of the stereotypes of the scandalous society woman who would dare to leave her husband.
Thank you. Katie?
Thank you. I've just seen some messages on the screen that people can't hear me, so I'm now going to loom much closer in, and I hope that will make a difference to you. So I'm doing my best here. So yeah, the cliche of the sun-bonneted, you know, what I call the Little House on the Prairie idea of the women going west, and of course that is true. That is completely true. Oh, you can hear me. Good, that's good. You know, there were women who were like that. In fact, in my book, one of the most sort of inspirational photographs, sorry, the book of photographs that I found in Paris was one such photograph. It was a typical picture of a woman with a wagon and giving her husband, his lunch at midday with a little white cloth on the table and so forth. But of course, there were. It wasn't only women like that. There were, as I said in my introduction, there were, many women of color who also did the journey, although it's much harder to find records for them, because quite often these women were slave women who were being forced to go west. They were being taken west as enslaved people with their hard to say with their families, but the people who owned them. And often these African Americans found their freedom in the West as a result. They would arrive in California, which was founded as a free state. And of course, later on, Oregon also became a free state. So then it became possible for them to find their freedom in that way. But one of the things that was so striking to me when I started to do my research is that, there was such an incredible variety of people. I mean, as you would expect, I don't think that is perhaps so incredibly surprising. But for example, they were not only, they were not just laboring people, farm people who made the trip. They were middle-class women and absolutely everything in between, right down to women who were kind of barely literate. And actually it's very well documented. A lot of these women wrote diaries and records of their particular experience when they were doing this journey. And some of the most poignant ones are the ones of these women who were barely literate, but they could write enough to write down what their experiences were. And these accounts have no punctuation in them, and they have, very idiosyncratic spelling, but they're obviously written literally in real time. So you can almost imagine these women sitting on the at the front of their wagons as they're going across the prairies, writing down exactly what their experiences are. And they are extraordinarily vivid accounts from this incredibly wide range of people of all different classes and all different ethnicities. I can see I'm much softer. Okay, I'm going to start really shouting now.
So I grew up in Kansas City, which now includes Westport, and Westport in Missouri was the great jumping off point for most of the migration trails that went to the West, and including the trade trail that we call the Santa Fe Trail. Women play a major role on all those trails, not just as observers, but active participants in that history of the American West. And Katie, you write about that. And likewise, April, women becoming part of that social fabric in South Dakota. So I'd like for you both, if you would, we're going to circle back to some of the other things you just said, but I'd like for you to address, for most people who don't know the American West very well, talk about the sense of place in which you set your volumes. And of course, Katie, you're in multiple places, and April, yours is too, because you do explore different parts of Dakota. So let's talk about that. Just kind of literally set the scene or scenes for where these things take place. So Katie, let's go to you first, because you're more all over the map, and then we'll circle back to April.
Okay, so I'm going to try and speak much louder now. So as Michael said, you know, the jumping off places were along the Missouri River for the most part. Independence, Missouri, and St. Joseph's were the two main ones. And people would gather in round about April time, and they would set off, you know, in these companies for safety. And they made a journey that was probably it was over 2,000 miles from the Missouri River to the Pacific, either the Pacific Northwest or to California, because my particular focus is the Oregon and the California trails. And so they were faced with this extraordinary journey, which until the mid-19th century had never been done by any, I was going to say any white women, I should really say any non-Native American woman had not done the journey until two Presbyterian missionaries attempted this journey in 1836. They survived their experience, which was 5 months hard journeying right the way, almost in a straight line across the continent. So the typical journey was from the Missouri borderlands across the Great Plains, then across the Rocky Mountains as far as a place called Fort Hall, and then the trails then divided into two, and people either literally turned right and they went up to what was then just known as Oregon country. It wasn't even part of the United States at the beginning of these migrations, or they turned left and they went to California. Ditto, at the beginning of the migrations, California was part of California, and the whole of the southwest of what is now the United States of America was predominantly owned, you know, by Mexico. So they were going to a foreign land at the very beginning, and it took them upwards of 5 months. And you know, they couldn't, you know, it was families all doing it together. So it wasn't just the women whose sort of endeavors were new, so to speak, but they were taking their children with them as well. I find that an extraordinary. And of course, the women were very often pregnant along the route and giving birth along the route as well. So it was particularly fraught with difficulties if you were a woman, but they were incredibly tough. They were, I would have said, just as tough as the men in terms of what they could endure and what they could survive. So the idea of the little frail, females is completely blasted apart when you consider what they were doing and the incredibly difficult terrain that they were having to journey across.
Thank you.
So the women in my book clearly were not facing the same sort of physical risks as the women you talk about, Katie. But I do think the journey is important for them too. So many of them were coming from New York, and it's probably worthwhile to take just a moment to understand why they were going to South Dakota, which is at the time in the 1890s, you had different divorce laws in every state. New York had one of the strictest. You could only get a divorce with proof of adultery. You needed to go to court, convince a judge that your partner had committed adultery, and only then could you separate from the marriage. Even if both partners wanted the marriage to end, you still had to have this adjudication. So these women often are leaving New York City, and it takes 4 days in the 1890s by train to head out to South Dakota and to head out to Sioux Falls. And so this trip is not a physical risk. It's not a physical hardship. For these women, it's more of a social risk and a social hardship. to take this trip to be going to Sioux Falls, which becomes this euphemism for getting a divorce, it is really putting their standing in their community in danger. So it takes them about 4 days. They head out, they go through Chicago, most of them, and then into Sioux Falls, which is the end of the line. And they end up in Sioux Falls because South Dakota has the laxest divorce laws in the country at this time. They're a holdover from Dakota Territory. So North Dakota also has these laxer laws, but it's less attractive. Sioux Falls has 5 railroad lines at the time and the best hotel for hundreds of miles. So that's why this city becomes the destination. It's just the easiest and most accommodating place to get to from the east. And one of the things that wowed me the first time I went out to Sioux Falls was it had a local architect who built much of the city. And he built it out of this local stone, this Sioux quartzite, which is this beautiful sort of purple pink, really hefty stone. And so when these women arrived, they actually found a town that was more familiar to them than they had anticipated. It looked like it had been there for longer than the sort of 15 years this city had been growing up. And so it felt a little more comfortable than a lot of the other places in South Dakota, and which you referenced, they do end up in, because when they go to Sioux Falls, the reporters follow them. And so to try to elude the reporters, many of them will live in Sioux Falls, but then go and file their divorces elsewhere in South Dakota, and experience those much smaller towns, much further away from what they're familiar with, including one woman who heads all the way to Deadwood in the opposite corner of the state, only to find the reporters are on the same train with her.
So since you made that popular culture reference to Deadwood, and since everyone thinks they know about the American West through that long-running series, April, can you go ahead and expand a little bit on Deadwood and what you learned from popular culture about Deadwood? And I don't know if you visited there or not yourself.
Did, yeah.
So can you talk about that and what you found as opposed to what you saw if you watched that show on HBO?
Sure. So for me, when I dove into the research and did get a chance to visit Deadwood as well, the physical surroundings were a surprise to me, having immersed myself in Sioux Falls. So you had a very different physical structure in Deadwood, much of it built out of wood, sort of growing up quickly, a little more the stereotyping you have in your head about what a Western city might have looked like. The fascinating bit to me, though, was we think of Deadwood as being this very lawless place, this anything goes. That's the reputation we've built up over the century, and that is not what these women found when it came to divorce. So Sioux Falls, they didn't love divorce seekers, but there was definitely an infrastructure there of lawyers and hoteliers and restaurateurs who were like, yeah, actually, this is pretty good business. Let's bring these wealthy women on in and have them stay here for 6 months or a year. When the women end up going out to Deadwood, they find just total dislike. We are not going to accept this as an industry in this town. In this place where anything goes, this is beyond the pale. We can't do this. And I found that sort of social attitude really fascinating, given what we think of as sort of the freewheeling Deadwood.
That's great. So Katie, jump in on the preconceptions you had about these places.
Well, I mean, I just was quite interested that you mentioned Deadwood, because I have watched quite a lot of the series, which I enjoyed actually, but for completely, just completely fantasy reasons. And one of the things that really intrigued me about it, this is slightly off tangent here, but is, of course, there's a portrait. One of the characters in it is Calamity Jane, and people. Whenever I said to anybody at all, even in England, where maybe that's why you can't hear me very well, because I'm talking from London, people would, I would say, I was writing about, women in the American West, and they would almost all of them immediately would say, oh yes, Calamity Jane. And actually, I should say right here and now that Calamity Jane takes up about less than maybe a paragraph in my book, because it's a complete mystery how she managed to get a hold of public imagination in the way that she did. There's very little, information about her that can be accurately corroborated. There was a diary that was written by somebody claiming to be her daughter, which was then exposed as a complete fraud. Actually, that in itself is a very interesting story. And she was just a sad old drunk. And actually, she is portrayed as a sad old drunk in the film, in the series. I think it's actually quite an accurate portrait of her. She was a drunkard and probably a part-time prostitute, which is not shown in Deadwood. And actually her story, the other women that I came across, their stories are so much more interesting than the story of Calamity Jane that she doesn't really mention much. She doesn't really warrant all that bigger place in my book. She was a sad old drunk. So that's my view about Deadwood. Also,
How about other places that you write about that you visited or were able to visit, and may have carried preconceptions, and you were either surprised or confirmed in what you learned?
It was maybe not quite, nothing that I could particularly, not really in the sense that you mean. I mean, one of the things that occurred to me when April was talking about Sioux Falls and South Dakota is just how quickly all these settlements, and in some cases quite big sophisticated cities, sprung up. The Sioux Falls that you describe in your book in the late 19th century, sort of 1880s around about, with this amazing huge hotel and a good railway service. Well, less than 50 years prior to that, that was just prairie. There was nothing there at all, literally nothing there. And that's the thing that surprised me, is that these first very small numbers of people started to go west in 1840. So when it was known that women, white non-Native American women, could do this journey, families started to make the trip, and it was very small numbers at the beginning. The first emigration in 1840 was actually one family, the Walker family, who ended up in Oregon. In 1841, it was 100 people. 1842, it was 200 people. 1843, it was 1,000 people. So it gradually grew in numbers. But this was a journey that took 6 months, and there were no white settlements there at all. There were a few mountain men, the traders and the trappers who were married to Native American women. There was one settlement in the far northeast, Fort Vancouver, which was actually a British trading post, and quite a sophisticated trading post, but that was in 1840. So in 40 years, or 50 years, that was just possible only to be, you had to walk. There was no other way to get there. Then the stagecoach, started to crisscross the continent. Telegraph poles were put up in 1860. The Pony Express was begun. Pony Express was begun in 1860 from a hotel in St. Joseph's, Missouri, the Patty Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1861, the Pony Express, that was a surprise to me. The Pony Express only lasted a year and a half, because in 1861, telegraph poles had been put the entire length, breadth of the continent. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869. So that was unbelievably fast. And then all these settlements, then it opened up the prairies. People had just really bypassed the prairies before. They were interested in going to Oregon and California, and then obviously the mining towns. I mean, Deadwood was a mining town, wasn't it? Which is why that became popular. But it was the railroads that opened up the prairies for people to come in and make the settlements there. But it was so incredibly fast. That's what really surprised me about it. is how quickly everything was. 50 years prior to the period you're writing about,
Mm-hmm.
there were Native American, Sioux Falls was I believe it was a place where Native American tribes met to rendezvous, where they met to trade. There were no whites there. That was the biggest surprise to me, was how fast it all was.
And on that vein, space and time are, I think, usually condensed in popular culture, when in fact you both touched on this, how long it took to either get to these places where you write more extensively about, but particularly crossing from the jumping off points, how slow travel went. And today, of course, in our all-consuming instant gratification society, making 10 miles a day with a wagon train, that was a good day. And if you were lucky, you found water. And if you were lucky, you found something to eat. Things we take for granted, because the Golden Arches are every 5 miles, of course, even today now, sadly. But there are places across the Western Dakotas, up into Wyoming and Montana and parts of West Texas, Eastern New Mexico today, that you can still go where you get some sense of the vastness of time. And I'd like for you to ask both of you if you could comment on the effect of space and the effect of isolation that these women felt, because you both write about that. In my own work in this area, and I'm not going to get into that too much, one of the things that's written about more extensively than anything is the loneliness. And I'd like for you both to talk about isolation and loneliness in the context of both your books. So April, go ahead, please.
Sure. So again, the women in my book experience sort of a more abstract sense of isolation and loneliness than I believe the women in Katie's book do. They are coming to an established town. Sioux Falls is 10,000 people at this point. It has a great theater, it has a great hotel. So in some ways they are surrounded by familiar things, but they are very separate from the townspeople who are there. Aside from these people who are making money off of their presence, it is really looked down upon to associate with them. They are very much excluded from the church communities there. Oftentimes, so you see some who make a great deal of friends among the other divorce colonists, but you also see some who themselves look down on the other divorce seekers, who feel that they themselves deserve a divorce and should come out here and do this, but don't wish to associate with the other women who they feel, are out there for improper reasons. So you really find these women who have chosen to say, I am going to make this sacrifice. I am going to live alone outside of my community in a place I've never seen before, for 6 months or a year, and know that when I return east, I may still be excluded from my community. I may still be excluded from my religious, chosen religious community because of the actions I've taken. So it is a more abstract sense of loneliness and isolation, but it is certainly something that played an important role in these women's decision to do this, and it was certainly a sacrifice they were very aware of in doing it.
Yes, that's really interesting. Well, my women, their situation was very different. Obviously, they were amongst the first ones to be making this extraordinary, many more than 6-month journey. And I would just like to say two things. One is that I did that journey myself when I was doing the research for the book. I didn't really write about it, but I did a road trip from Independence, Missouri, all the way to San Francisco, because I have family in San Francisco. My husband's brother and his wife live in San Francisco. So we rented a car, and I wanted to see for myself what those spaces were like, could get some kind of sense of it. And I was, you were saying, Michael, that we don't have the same idea of space and time, and that is completely true. But even in a modern car on a modern highway, with air conditioning and a GPS, It's a very long journey. It took me a month. It took me a month, pretty much. I stopped off in places, but I didn't spend long anywhere much. I just followed the California Trail. It was an amazing journey, but you would go over the Rocky Mountains, then you descend, you go over the Wasatch Mountains, which are the mountains that people had to get across before they went into the Great Salt Lake Basin. And you drove for days all the way across from Salt Lake City all the way to the Sierra Nevada mountains. The idea that anybody could possibly have walked along there is quite astonishing to me. And I have to confess, I started the book. My sympathies lie quite strongly with the Native American tribes whose way of life was shattered by these people, these settler colonists coming in, but absolute respect, frankly, to those women and those families who walked every inch of the way, particularly across the Great Salt Lake. It's extraordinary to me, and it was a great experience. But talking about particular women and their isolation, the two women who really stood out for me, just the sort of mind-numbing isolation and to being cut off from absolutely everything that they knew, were these first two missionary women who did this journey in 1836. And I'm sure you have all heard of them, Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spaulding. And they were Presbyterian missionaries. They went west they were both married, but they both married men that they barely knew. I mean, they'd known their husband something like a week before they married them, because in order to be a missionary, you couldn't be a single woman, you had to be married. So it was like a business arrangement that they had with these two men. When they said goodbye to their families, they were both from the eastern part of America. They said goodbye to their families in the certain knowledge they were never going to see their families ever again. That was it. They were never going to see their parents again. They were never going to see their siblings or their extended family or any of their friends. When they were going to Oregon country, as it was then known, it was disputed land between Great Britain and the United States, obviously lived in by Native American tribes, but it wasn't part of the United States. So it was like going to China or Africa. I mean, they had to get passports from the War Office before they were able to go. And I think that I don't agree with the missionary endeavor. That's my personal opinion. They went to preach and convert the Cayuse and the Nez Perce people, and it ended very badly indeed. But spare some sympathy for these two women that gave up absolutely everything they knew. Nobody thought, the American Board of Commissioners who gave them sort of permission to go, there was no training. These women knew nothing about the conditions that they were going to find when they got there. They knew nothing about the people that they were going to live amongst, and none of the men bothered, not even the husband seemed to have bothered to inquire, what the conditions were going to be like when they got there. So there wasn't anything. And the two women didn't really get on together. There was kind of bad blood between them from the outset. So the one, that's loneliness, isn't it? I mean, the one other woman who was there, who you might have a bond with, who might help you when you had your baby, might help you in childbirth, or any of the sort of, that the female solidarity that was so much a part of the other companies, the other immigrant companies who went, these two women had absolutely none of that. And that is real isolation and real loneliness. And I came to have a lot more sympathy and sort of empathy for these two women, really, when I realized exactly the extent of what they'd given up and what they did in order to, by their own standards and by their own lights, to do a noble thing. They were two very extraordinary women.
Thank you. I've read journals and other things, as you both have, letters, etc. And one of the things that struck me, one of the quotations, and I can't quote it, I'll just mention it, is that many of these women on these isolated homesteads would climb to the highest point just to see something move, It didn't have to be human. It could be a bison, it could be a coyote, it could be anything, just to know they were not alone. And by the same token, what April was talking about is being absolutely alone in a crowded room, the same sort of thing. And that's, of course, what people of color faced in the large communities of homesteaders, for example, and settlers in the West. And we see the American West, and the world still sees the American West largely as a place that symbolizes freedom and opportunity, but really only if you're a white man. And I think that's important to remember. These women, even the married women, the women who went along as wives and mothers, et cetera, if the man died, they had no property rights. So the homestead did not go to the widow. It might go to the eldest surviving male child, but the women had no property rights across the American West. And so I want to let's address, if you don't mind, indulge me a little bit here about that myth of opportunity for women. And I'm going to tell a tiny personal story here. My great grandmother and her sisters came out of Ontario, Canada, escaped an abusive father who probably was a pedophile. That would be my great-great-grandfather. And they became prostitutes in Buffalo, New York, and various communities across Ohio, and eventually settled in Kansas City. But one of them, Lily Davy, who was my great-great-grandaunt, became famous as a stagecoach robber in Arizona after she had opened her own brothel and opium den in Phoenix and fled Phoenix. And when in desperate times, became an outlaw. She wasn't very good at it. She was arrested and was the only female prisoner at the infamous Yuma Penitentiary in Western Arizona. But this is all to say that opportunities for women were quite limited. And the way I see them, and this is just me speaking from my own work in the genre, is they did what they had to do to get by until circumstances might improve. And taking that as a suggestion, would you both comment on that for your protagonists in both your volumes, please?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. So I would say that one of the things that always surprised me is the real disconnect between these women and the people in Sioux Falls, because in a lot of ways, I do think they were looking for the same thing. They had this idea that the American West was a place to go and redefine yourself and to claim something of yourselves. And the white settlers in Sioux Falls and these women could not see that connection between themselves, which I thought was really interesting. But two things I always underline to people when I'm talking about this book is that, one, South Dakota did not set up lax divorce laws and intend women to take advantage of them. This is essentially a loophole that's happening. So no credit to the Dakota Territory Legislature for saying women need their freedom. No, this is a loophole that they're going there to exploit. And then, don't want to spoil anything here, but the women who get divorced typically remarry, and often quite quickly. And the reason they do that is because marriage at this time, so 1890, is the single most important decision economically, socially, politically, a woman can make. This is the opportunity for her, in large part for most people, to define the terms of her life. And so I often have people disappointed to realize that these women who have gone off to get a divorce and seek their freedom then remarry. And I just think it's important to remember that they simply wanted an opportunity to make a different choice. But they did still within this stricture in which few of them had job opportunities, few of them had property. They needed to make this choice because it was their economic prosperity.
Thank you. Katie.
Thank you. Yes, that's an absolutely amazing story, Michael. Well, I write about, brothels and prostitution quite a lot in my book, because that is one of the, how should we put this? One of the avenues that was available to women who had to get by. And of course, you know, while there were many women who went west, it was in very large part very male dominated. So, for example, army posts were very male dominated, and also anywhere where there was mining, Deadwood would be one of those places. Also Virginia City, where Mark Twain worked as a journalist for a while. And obviously San Francisco, you know, during the gold rush were extremely male dominated areas. And of course, the minute you get that, you do get women coming in to service them in the form of prostitutes and brothels. So I would say two things about that. One is that yes, you know, this was women getting by. This was no woman is going to become a prostitute from choice, or very, very rarely. Maybe there are some examples of very entrepreneurial women. I have one example, Sarah Bowman, the so-called Great Western, who was a very significant entrepreneur and ran brothels that were very successful, ran these places called places of resort, which were places of entertainment for men. You know, they were basically servicing men, but unlike just your regular prostitutes, you know, she was able to control and make money out of them. But women like Sarah Bowman were extremely rare. Most of the prostitutes, you know, this is one of the ways in which the kind of what I would call the Hollywood version of the West has done a big disservice to women, because you tend to get, you know, the kind of the whore with the heart of gold, if I can put it like that, or the saloon, the rather glamorous saloon girls. Actually, there is a very energetic brothel in Deadwood, isn't there? You know, where you're shown these women who, you know, seem to be doing okay. Actually, prostitution was unbelievably brutal, unpleasant, nasty in every way. And most of the women who ended up being prostitutes died violently. They died violent deaths, either at somebody's hand or very often at their own hands, because you only descended into prostitution if all else failed.
Yep.
So, you know, sometimes it was an avenue for people, for women to, you know, really make good, and as in the case of Sarah Bowman. But the vast majority of women who were entered into prostitution, it was not not desirable for them in any way. Yeah. So.
Throwing a larger bird's eye view of the American West, I would ask that both of you, and before I say this, I'll ask those who are listening in and watching, please throw your questions into the Q&A, because after this question, we're going to turn to that and see what questions you've thrown in there, and also in the chat. So please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A column so we can address them directly. But back to the bird's eye view. Most people don't know this, but the passage of the 19th Amendment was already preceded by virtually every state west of the Mississippi by decades. In fact, women had the right to vote in Wyoming by 1869. Most people don't realize that, and they far led the more quote unquote progressive parts of the U.S. and the East Coast by decades, in fact. And so I'd like for you to both place your stories in the context of women's independence and ultimately gaining a voice in the political and social spectra, and see how that might have played a role, or at least moving the ball forward, let's say, towards women's suffrage. So, Katie, go first, please.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I don't actually write particularly about women's suffrage, because it's kind of slightly off the subject of my book. But it is absolutely the case that these women traveling west, no matter what their ethnicity or their class might have been, you know, they were the ones who survived it, who survived the whole experience, and who survived the loneliness and the sheer, you know, back-breaking drudgery of it. It made for women who were definitely of an independent cast of mind. And also they were, you know, they were making not a new society, because they were bringing the mores of the society that they left with them, but they were making these new settlements and new cities, and there was a feeling that people, and I think it's true that, and not just a myth about the West, that people went there if they wanted to start over, and they wanted to start again. And I think that the famed American sense of independence and wanting to do things for yourself, and not wanting your government to interfere too much with your rights, wanting to be autonomous as humanly possible. I think that the West was a very good was a very vigorous ground for fostering that kind of independence of spirit without question. And it doesn't surprise me at all that the women got the vote, or got the vote so much earlier in the Western territories and states than they did in the East. They thought they'd earned it. They thought that what they'd done had earned them the right to have a say in how their society was governed. Quite right too.
Thank you. April?
So in South Dakota in the 1890s, which is where my book starts, women can vote for and run for school committee. That's the best they've got at this time. But there is a really interesting interaction in my book around how the suffragists felt about divorce. And it was very divided. So you do have a big suffragist movement at this point. But there are some women who believe, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who believes that divorce is as important as the vote, that this is an absolutely essential to women's freedom. And then you have a lot of the more religious groups, the Women's Christian Temperance Union among them, who could not possibly ally themselves with a group that believed divorce and the vote should be connected. So you find that the suffragists can pretty much agree on only one thing, which is that there should be women in the room when decisions are being made about divorce. Now, largely that doesn't happen, but it's one of the most interesting things about the phenomenon of Sioux Falls. So over the course of about 20 years, you have women going out to South Dakota to get divorces, absolutely individual decisions. They are not there as activists. They are there because they themselves need freedom from their marriages. But in going out there, in the numbers that they did, which was actually not as large as the newspapers would have you believe, but in the numbers they did, and in the persistency that they continued coming despite the obstacles, you find that these women force this conversation into rooms they do not otherwise have access to. So we see the conversation about the divorce start happening in religious communities, among religious leaders, among which there are not many women. You see this happen in legislatures that don't have women, in the courts without women, and in the White House. So despite the fact they don't yet have this vote, the power of a group of women demanding the thing they need ends up making change.
Thank you. I will say this about my great-granddad, who went by the alias Pearl Hart when she was arrested in 1899. In front of several witnesses, she Cosmopolitan sent a reporter. Cosmopolitan magazine, of course, in those days was quite different than the Cosmo we see today. Did a feature article on her because she became something of a national celebrity, because there weren't a whole lot of female stagecoach robbers. She was alleged to have said the following, quote, "I shall never submit to be tried under the law that neither I nor my sex had a voice in making," end quote. So she became something of a suffrage darling for that very brief time, until I think they realized that she was a criminal. And maybe that's not the spokesperson you want. I think we have time to turn to the Q&A. So I'm going to read the questions and then I'd ask you both. And if it's germane to one or the other, go ahead and take the lead. The first question is, did the women going for a divorce take their children with them? So April, that's you.
Yes, some of them did. So we did have 2, 3, 4-year-olds hanging out at the Cataract House Hotel. Oftentimes they were seeking to keep custody of their children, and keeping them in their physical custody was part of how they made that happen. So yes, you do see women not going out there necessarily alone, but with their children as well.
Okay, so question 2 is to Katie. How realistic was the old TV series Wagon Train?
Oh gosh, I don't think I ever saw that. I don't have any personal knowledge of that, but I can tell you that perhaps you could tell me, Michael, is that a one from back in the 70s or something?
It's from the 60s. Yeah.
From the 60s,
Ward Bond and some others. Yep.
Okay, I would take an educated guess that it would have been accurate in parts, as in, the relationships between the people who were going, and the fact that they were in wagons. The thing that would have probably almost certainly not been true about it would have been their portrayal of the Native American,
Absolutely.
the Native American tribes. I'm hazarding a guess there. Often played by actors, white actors with blacked out faces, and you never knew where the native tribes were coming from. You never got their side of the story. You never realized that they could have, the so-called savages, had perhaps good reason to attack the wagon trains. They have their bison, their bison herds absolutely decimated, their food supplies decimated. They had their ancestral, most sacred lands, Deadwood, for example, all the area around the Black Hills were absolutely sacred to the Lakota and their heartland. So many people coming in. Most Native Americans actually welcomed the white immigrants at the beginning, because there was opportunities to trade with them, and in the end, it just became a numbers game. That's rather a crude way of putting it, but there were just too many of them,
Right.
and they interfered with the food supplies. They dug up the land. That there's a much bigger story going on there than you ever get in those early accounts. That's a rather rude reply, but I hope it does.
I'd jump in here and also add that they obviously the Clemens did a great deal, because there was, and Katie writes about this, there was far more death on these trips because sickness was common, bad water, cholera, all kinds of things were happening. So children were dying right and left, adults were dying right and left, and everyone is far too clean. Remember, you're wearing the same clothes you start out in. You're not changing your clothes. And the animals would die. I mean, everybody's riding in the wagons in the TV shows. Well, animals get tired too. And Katie touched on this. Most everybody on a wagon train was walking, because they're hauling all kinds of stuff. And then they start dropping trash, because the heavier the wagons, the harder it is on the oxen or the mules or the horses. So they start dropping stuff. And in other words, the beginning of litter in the American West is full of trash. So I got to move on to the next question. Biggest surprise during your research, and let's both answer this, please. So April, go ahead. Biggest surprise.
There are a couple of spots in Sioux Falls that still stand from the period of the divorce colony, and one of them is the church that the bishop who opposed divorce. It was his home church, and it is a beautiful church. And today, there are some stained glass windows that hang there that were donated by one of the divorce colonists. It was a scandal at the time. He would not allow them hung. And to see them up there today was such a lovely surprise to me. And I've been told that the panels at the bottom have been scratched out, so they're not dedicated to the woman and her family who donated them. But I've been told that the church is hoping to restore them now.
So there were so many, but I would just mention one, which is I came across this rather extraordinary woman called Marguerite McCasland, who was the first lady of Fort Vancouver when the two missionaries arrived there in 1836, and she was half Cree. She was half Native American, but a woman of great refinement and I won't say elegance, but she gave the two missionary women lessons in local etiquette, and I think gave them a massive surprise as well, because they just thought that all Native American women were savages, the savages of popular imagination. And this woman, Marguerite McCasland, kind of exploded their ideas about what a Native American woman was or could be.
I think I see our host up there. I think we may be out of time. do we have time for the last question?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. In the film Westward the Women, a whole train consisted of women and Robert Taylor. Were there wagon trains of just women going west on the trails?
Wow, I don't think so. Not that I ever discovered. Although that that anything's possible, I guess. I think the biggest sort of collection of women unattached to their families. It was quite unusual for single women to make the journey. Single women did do it, but it was usually women who were married with families. But I think when when prostitution became a big thing, particularly in San Francisco, because there were literally this tiny little village exploded in size practically overnight when gold was discovered, and you got very large influxes of women coming in to to being employed by these brothels. So maybe some of them made the journey by wagons, but I think mostly that is probably a fantasy. Quite a good one though.
And April writes about this, and Katie writes about this, and Katie mentioned this, is how quickly railroad traffic made wagon trains obsolete. That window of time is relatively small. And then, of course, train travel. And April, you wrote about this being scandalous for a woman to ride a train by herself. I think we need to remember the social mores of the day were pretty prescriptive. So women on a wagon train, I've never run across that in my research, and I've been doing this a little while. I never have seen that, and it's entirely possible. But the one thing I would say is, and this was not based on any gender, how poorly equipped people were to go west. They brought the oddest things and the least useful things to go west. Nearly always, and family heirlooms were the biggest thing they dropped along the trail. Unfortunately, you got to take the piano. Well, okay. Why?
Don't worry. It's Sioux Falls. You can rent one.
Yeah.
Yes, the complete works of Shakespeare. So useful on the prairies.
Yeah.
You can understand why, but yeah, you're quite right what you said earlier about it was much too clean, the portrayals in movies, and some of the descriptions of the litter, in a whole bookcases, the equivalent of 3-piece suites, and actually the Laramie, on the Laramie Plains, these mixed race communities, the mountain men marrying the Native American women. There's a wonderful account I came across about how well furnished the houses were there, because they all the stuff that was being dropped, because it was just their oxen couldn't cope with the weight of it.
Mm-hmm. I think we've run out of questions. I think are we at the end of our time?
Yes, there is one question in the chat that I didn't want to leave unaddressed, even though we are out of time. But there, someone did ask about women's disappearances on reservations, whether that was true or not. And I think it's been proven that it is absolutely true.
Absolutely. Huge problem today.
Yeah.
Huge problem.
Yeah. So yes, not to end on that, but the things that women went through in the 19th century continue to happen now, and we should continue to do our best to support women, those of us who aren't women especially. So thank you so much to Katie and April and Michael for joining us for this amazing conversation. If you joined us late or want to go back and rewatch the program, you can do so on our YouTube channel. You can also check out our events page to see all our upcoming programs. We are having the holidays at the Mark Twain House, and we have Museum Store Sunday on Sunday, November 27th. So if you are in Connecticut or in the Northeast within driving distance, please join us. We have discounts at our store, free snacks, drinks, and activities, festive music, dramatic readings with historic interpreters, and holiday tours of the house. Come experience the holidays with us. Mark Twain was from Missouri, so we do have that Western connection there. Thank you again to everyone, and have a good day or evening wherever you are.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for having us.
Thank you very much.
April, and thank you, Michael, so much. You were
Enjoyed it.
The MC. Thank you all.
What a
Adios.
treat.
Okay,
Bye.
adios, amigos. Yeah, okay, bye now.